Swapna Little is an author and historian who specializes in the history of Delhi. She has been closely involved in the movement to preserve heritage monuments and sites. She is currently the convener of the Delhi chapter of the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, INTAC. Her latest books are Connaught Place, The Making of New Delhi, and Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi. Thank you so very much for being here with us, ma'am. We are so very honored by your presence. I'll just start. Delhi has been through so many changes. Do you think there is a feature of Delhi that has remained the same throughout the centuries?
So one thing that has not changed at all during the centuries is that for a long time, Delhi has been receiving people coming from outside. People have come from outside, whether you talk about the 12th century when the Turks came and set up the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughals came, but it's not just empires or empire builders, but people have come from everywhere. And this is the nature of big cities. It's only villages which have these self-contained communities. Even that is not true actually, but villages, these are not great magnets of people from outside, but cities are. And people have come from all over the all around, and they have made it their home, and they have contributed a little bit of their own culture to the making of the city. And every time we feel that this is something new that is happening, but it's not. It's been happening for centuries. So in 1947 was one of the times when a lot of that happened. But the population suddenly grew because there was an influx. But we've been seeing this kind of growth all through. We have in fact, every Delhi, like every big metropolis, is a city of migrants. So I think I would say, if there's one thing that hasn't changed, it is this.
That is a very interesting perspective. Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of skepticism among the general populace regarding historians and academic history in general, and a lot of them are often swayed by popular perceptions of the past. Like, for instance, there is a belief that most of the Indo-Islamic structures, including many like those in the Qutub complex in Delhi, were built after demolishing the existing Hindu structures of that time. How can we possibly bridge this gap between popular ideas and academic history and make history much more accessible to the people?
Um, I think the problem is that there is a huge burden on historians, like there isn't on other, I would say, academic disciplines. Look at something like medicine, for instance. A
Mhm.
doctor has specialized knowledge, and between themselves, within the discipline of medicine, they communicate through academic papers, they communicate through books, textbooks, other monographs. All that writing takes place. It's in highly technical language, but that's okay. It is supposed to be between doctors. These are exchanges between doctors. Now, the problem is historians also communicate like this. We write monographs, we write research theses, academic uh, articles, etc. But for some reason, because I suppose there is so much public interest in history, that people are constantly demanding that historians should spend their time writing for a general lay readership, which say people are not demanding that of engineers or doctors. How many people are saying engineering manuals are too difficult for a lay person to read? Nobody is complaining about that. They're meant to be engineering manuals, therefore they have certain amount of technical language. I would say, compared to that, the average history book is actually a lot more accessible. So that charge that it is not accessible is slightly unfair, I would say. We are not expecting that of other academic disciplines. But be that as it may, as I said, the reason for that is because a lot of people are actually interested in history. So I would say that yes, there is some need for historians to be writing in a more accessible manner. As I said, it's difficult for them. You are supposed to be writing your peer reviewed for peer reviewed publications as well. For your career advancements, you need all those things, and then you're supposed to write for a general reading public also. But again, if you don't write, then that space gets filled up with people who have no training in history and therefore are making pronouncements on subjects which they don't really understand that well. So it is a complicated thing, but I would say that there's a lot of history writing that is happening, which is actually quite accessible. And before people dismiss historians as writing difficult texts which we cannot read, I'd say give it a try. History writing is still a lot easier to understand for a non-specialist also. So before you give it up and go only for very easy popular writing, I think even the lay reader should give historians a chance, because a historian's training does make a difference to the kind of content they write and how they analyze things. And yes, if you then ignore historical writing and go for a lot of pop, and these days of course it's complicated by the fact that there's so much stuff that is on the internet which has no credibility. I mean, anybody can put up anything on the internet. So people proliferate, and the more sensational it is, the more quickly it proliferates over the internet. So a lot of information and misinformation is actually floating around, and no way of discerning what is what. So it is up to the reader, to the listener, to actually say, where am I getting this information? Who is putting this up? What are their credentials as historians? I mean, and by historians, I mean, do they have any research experience in the field of history? Those are the kind of questions you should ask.
I think the biggest example becomes this entire Tajo Mahal like discussion,
Yeah.
like the amount of forwards that we have received, like so many, because I studied history. So many of my uncles and aunts keep sending me this thing. Is it true? Like, is it actually what happened? I'm like, no, please don't believe it. It's not at all true. Like, just check who sent it. Like that person, like there's no credit given. There is no credit given. Somebody has just written something on WhatsApp and has forwarded it. Do not believe it. So yes, I completely agree with you on that point. But ma'am, do you think that conducting more heritage walks can really help in this regard? Like often when you have something in the book and actually visiting a place uh, with an expert and seeing all those things is going to have a very different impact on a person, like on a general member of the public. So do you think conducting heritage walks can help in this regard?
Yes, of course. Heritage walks help in generating awareness about places. And I would say, even among history students, when I was studying history in college, I remember that the idea that you could, we had the mandatory art and architecture sections in our syllabus, but we very rarely actually, even, and I was in Delhi, so I could easily have gone, but nobody really said go and actually see these places, see these buildings, to see what we are talking about in the book. So I think there was too little of that. There is much greater awareness now. And yes, it really helps. Let me give the example, say, of Qutub Minar. You mentioned the fact that, the whole temple destruction idea is there. Now, when you go to the Qutub Minar, you actually see those temples, the temples which were destroyed during the war of conquest, and how they have been reused in the mosque. Now, that is there. The question then arises is, how does somebody who is explaining that site to you, a walk leader, and I've been through to the standard guides who take you there, and how they explain it to you, and how somebody who's actually studied the site, and I have studied the site, I have written articles on it, how I understand it can be very, very different, because it is not it is to discuss, and that's what a historian does, understand contexts. How does this destruction take place? What is the context? What is the idea behind it? How does that site develop after that? Because this is a period of conflict which is followed by the consolidation of the Delhi Sultanate, which takes a very different turn. It is not as if that moment of conflict or what happened during that conflict then carries on indefinitely, where the whole history of Sultanate and Mughal Delhi becomes one of oppression. So that is the problem, that when you make that one moment stand in for the all the centuries that follow after that. So that those are the kind of nuances that a historian can bring to the discussion of a site like that. And I think that's why uh, the kind of walks that specialists do really help in understanding sites, and particularly complicated sites.
No, um, that's very rightly put. And I think like some as a former student of history, like in all the heritage walks that I've attended, there's always something great that I've taken away. And like even though I have studied all those things, I have studied about those places theoretically, but actually being in those spaces and witnessing them firsthand is a whole different experience. So yes. Um, Ma'am, how far do you think we can engage the local people in the process of conservation of structures and local art? And also, do you think that can serve a pedagogic purpose?
I think it's very important. I'll tell you why.
Hmm.
Because a lot of these sites which we see today as monuments, the Qutub Minar site, for instance, was originally a part of the community of Mehrauli. It was actually during colonial times that these became monuments. Now, for various reasons, it makes sense for us today to continue to manage them in monuments, particularly the big sites like the Qutub Minar, Humayun's tomb. Nobody's saying that these should not be managed in a professional manner. Uh, and, I mean, they are major tourist sites. But when we broaden our scope of heritage and look a little further, look at monuments, say, which are slightly off the beaten track, particularly in Delhi, for instance. I look at an ASI protected monument, like, say, the Begumpur Masjid. It's an
Hmm.
enormous mosque. It is the second largest mosque in Delhi. It was built in the 14th century. And around it is the Begumpur village. And the village
Hmm.
is like really, really close to the walls of the mosque.
Hmm.
Now, what generally used to happen was, in fact, uh, till all the I think the 1920s, the many of the villagers was actually living in the mosque. It was only
Hmm.
acquired later. The mosque was acquired and was turned into a monument. Now, what happens is, a mosque like that, it's not as if it's seeing a huge number of tourists coming there. It should, I think the people there should be encouraged to use that mosque for informal meetings, for sitting down and chatting, ladies enjoying the sun. I think even though they are not living there, they should be allowed to do all these things. What happens is that because we kind of police the monument against the people who are living in its immediate vicinity and who have a connect to it, a historical connect to it, we are pushing them out, and we are putting the railings and locks and guards and all that. So all these benign activities, which, and of course it should be monitored so that no actual harm is being done, but these benign activities get kept out, and therefore a resentment develops among people for this monument. And on the other hand, the people who are really uh, uh, not up to any good will somehow find a way of climbing the railing, going in, and they are the ones who will then damage the monument, and sometimes make it unsafe also. You have people who you go in, and there are, you obviously see lots of strewn bottles of alcohol and all that. So so in fact, by excluding local communities, you are making the place more vulnerable, whereas use in a sensitive manner could actually be good for the monument. Beyond that, I also look at that heritage which is not state owned, because we
Hmm.
define heritage in many different ways. So, a 200-year-old house in Mehrauli village is
Hmm.
also heritage, and that may be somebody's property. Somebody is living there. How do we uh, how do we make sure that is protected and that is preserved for posterity, because that also is heritage, it is worth protecting. And there is legal protection because these are often listed buildings, but it makes no legal protection makes no sense unless the people who live in that recognize its value as heritage, not simply as the plot of land on which it stands, and therefore it is much more economic, makes more economic sense to demolish it and build a 4-story house, or that kind of thing. They have to see the value in that heritage, and the state has to help. The state
Hmm.
has to help to generate that value in that heritage, and that should be done. That can be done through things like good heritage policies, good tourism policies also. I always give this example of, say, Agra. Agra has
Hmm.
3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, right?
Yeah.
The Taj Mahal, the Agra Fort. Does it have 3? Does it have 2?
Um,
Only 2. Sikandra is close by also.
yeah,
But
it's nearby. Like it's in the like
yeah,
yeah, like somewhere it's
so
clubbed
it has,
together.
yeah, it has a lot of these important monuments. It it has a The city also has a large population. If you compare it to, there is a small town in Savannah,
Hmm.
in southern US, in Georgia. It's called Savannah. It receives double the number of visitors that Agra gets. It has no UNESCO World Heritage Sites, no important monuments. It only has a well preserved historic district. Beautiful
Okay.
houses. Some of them, one is so many of them are heritage hotels. Many of them are restaurants. Many of them are shops. It's just the ambience which an old historic
Hmm.
neighborhood has, and that's what attracts people, and people go and spend 3 days there, whereas people will go one day to Agra and will try and finish off Fatehpur Sikri, Agra Fort and Taj Mahal in one day and come away, because they
Yeah,
don't want
there's
to
like
stay
oh
there.
quickly like just wrap it up like
Just
don't.
see the monument. They don't want to hang out in the city. Whereas
Mhm.
if you concentrate on the city, it's ambient. And Agra also is an old town. You can do a lot to the monuments, etc. And similarly with Delhi, Shahjahanabad, of course, people go there. But once you've been there, where can you spend time? Where can you spend time? Are there places? I mean, street food is all very well, but street food doesn't take very much time. So it's not as if people will stay very much time. And the economic benefits of tourism only happen when people spend some time in a place. So
Mhm.
the public private partnership, and I'm talking about a public which is the general public, not corporates.
Yeah,
The private
yeah.
should be
Mhm.
uh, small people, the whether it is people who are specializing in food, whether owners of heritage properties. These are the kind of people, young people who are leading walks. All this has to come together to you become to make transform heritage into an economic asset, and only when it turns into an economic asset can this become sustainable and viable, because otherwise you can't expect people to preserve heritage only on sentiment and this great idea that this our great legacy or heritage. It's not
Mhm.
enough, because people have to earn their livings also.
And I think something I completely agree with you was that when we were talking about when you mentioned about how like all these places used to be common places of their respective times, and somewhere these were always like now they are monuments, but these were living spaces. They, as much as people need them, the spaces also need people to engage with them, interact with them, and actually uh, make the spaces useful for the people. And so yeah, I think that is something absolutely right. And with so many small little monuments in every little corner of Delhi, it needs to be put into better use for the general public, and that is not going to be beneficial just for the public but also for the monument, like for like a better preservation of the monument. Yes. um Ma'am, in your opinion, are non-government organizations better equipped to deal with conservation and heritage promotion because they do not associate with ideologies of nationalism or of political and social identities?
uh, well, I would not say that uh, organizations are necessarily politically neutral. They may not be.
Hmm.
Uh, but as far as preservation, they have often have greater uh, responsiveness to immediate public demands
mm,
of change. These are things that uh, an, a non-governmental body can do much quicker. So let me give you one example. The Delhi Delhi state,
mm,
uh, Delhi state itself is a fairly new entity, right? I mean,
mm,
it's not one of the older states. It's been
mm,
around for less, but one of the things, it has a department of archaeology which actually does a lot of protection and conservation of buildings. Now they don't have a very big staff. They don't have a very big staff. It's not a very big department, but all their conservation work is done through INTAC. And
okay,
that is actually quite a good relationship, because a uh, the department, because it's not very bloated, it does not have a huge staff, a huge technical
mm,
personnel, etc. It's less of a burden on the taxpayer. INTAC does work on a consultancy basis. We do the work that is required to be done without that permanent personnel being employed in the department itself. And because we have professional expertise, we do an equally good job. It's not as if it's compromised, because we are a technically competent body as well.
mm,
And then we can then interface our conservation work with our heritage awareness work also. So while we are doing conservation work, we are also doing that outreach among the people of Delhi, so that the message of conservation goes out to a wider public. So I think this kind of involvement is, I think, good in the conservation field.
okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And with also with certain, as you rightly mentioned, certain professional expertise of a non-government organization, they can be more of an asset to the to work with the government and actually work in a lot of these areas. Um, Ma'am, how far do you think the post-colonial government in India managed to appropriate the imperial edifice of the colonial government in its nation-building exercise, perhaps sometimes at the cost of erasing provincial culture?
uh, the colonial period was a big gap in our there were a lot of things that were
Mhm,
disrupted. If you look at one very simple example, our education system was disrupted,
mhm,
in the sense of you know we got western style colleges. The educational system was completely overhauled, particularly higher education, primary, whatever you see it. Nobody will say
mhm,
that the education system that we have today is a continuation of the kind of education system that we had in North India during the late Mughal period. No,
mhm,
it's different. The practice of architecture is
mhm.
a modern practice. So all that has necessarily changed. Our political systems have changed. Now, instead of seeing this simply as, okay, this is colonial and therefore we should throw it out, and before that what was there was Mughal, so we should throw that out, and then which was before that was Sultanate, which was also alien, so let's throw it out and go back to some pristine Indian
This idea of
past.
India, like true
Yeah,
India,
so
like which is
yeah,
so bizarre. Like,
yeah.
yeah, sorry.
So what we have actually is a process of change, and many things have happened during that process of change. We have to see, and I think our founding fathers of modern independent India were quite pragmatic about these things, to say, let us work with what we have and try and see how we can make a better India. What we did not like, let's get rid of it. What we like, let us keep, and let us try and improve it. So therefore, that was that pragmatic idea without sentimentality about anything. So they said, okay, we don't think colonial rule is good, the British should not be ruling us. That does not mean that everything that the British did here should be thrown out. We have to work with the system, because if we throw it out, how do we replace it? What do we put in its place? That will require a lot of time and effort and not useful. So it was a pragmatic approach. And therefore, as I say, the ASI also was the creation of a colonial government.
Hmm.
But our aim should be how to keep it moving, keep it evolving, keep it changing to meet our needs as they are today, but keep it, because this is, like it or not, one way or the other, that is what manages most of our nationally protected monuments. So these institutions, these spaces, how they have evolved, this is a historical process. And we cannot throw everything out, but we have to see how things can be managed better. And uh, there can never be ideal situations, but we have to make
Mhm.
the best of what there is. I don't know whether that was the thrust of your question, but if you had some other angle, please let me know.
No, no, I think that more or less covers what I wanted to ask you. Okay, I'm just gonna ask the last question now. Um, what do you think is a better way of preserving monuments? By either keeping it in its natural state, making bare minimum repairs, since even the destruction of a monument, partial or otherwise, has its own history? Or do you think it's better to use modern repair techniques extensively to restore it to its pristine state?
uh, I think there are various aspects to this. One
Hmm.
is the use of modern. I'll come to that later, actually. Let me start from the beginning. One is the conservative approach, which there's a tech term for this: conserve as found. So
Okay.
if you find a ruin, try and consolidate it so that it does not deteriorate further, but keep it in that state of a ruin. Now, that applies to a lot of buildings that are around. That is the default option, which actually the ASI uses, which a lot of, because, for instance, you have some sort of a ruined, a building that is in disuse. It may be a tomb, it may be a mosque, whatever. It's not in use anymore. It is there as a monument to the past. You conserve it as found. The second thing is, and this applies particularly to buildings that are in use, they have to be, uh, or let me even before I come to buildings that are in use, there are important structures which are uh, of great value, like Humayun's tomb, for instance, right? Humayun's tomb or other buildings which are uh, of interest, are tourist attractions, etc. Now, their choices may be made as to how much you will put in. Now, most of the time, the idea is that where there are missing elements. So, I'll give you the example of, there's a tomb in Vasant Vihar called Bada Lao Ka Gumbad near the Basant Lok
Yes.
market.
Yes. Yes.
Bada Lao Ka Gumbad intact, conserved, and we found that there were traces of blue tiles, a striped pattern of blue tiles on the dome. And we
Okay.
saw that, and we have a technical committee which evaluates these things. They have members of the ASI also. And we had a meeting with the technical committee, and we said, since we know what are the materials that were used, that this used to be blue tile on this dome, should we try and bring that back? And it took us a long time to really match the texture and color of those particular tiles. In any case, all the conservation that we do, all the repair work we do, we make sure that all the material used is the original material, in the sense in which all these old buildings, they were not made of cement, as we
Hmm.
these days use, but they used limestone mortar and limestone plaster. So we always, in any case, all the repair that we do, all the conservation that we do, we in any case use the original material only. We match it very carefully. So in this case, wherever the tiles were missing, we added new tiles, but closely matching the specification of the older, what was there earlier. So that is, when you say conserve is found, this is going one step further and saying we are restoring the monument.
Hmm.
Now, restoration may also mean rebuilding certain parts. If
Hmm.
you find half an arch, you have a good idea what the rest of the arch look like, right? So you can reconstruct it. So that is going one step further. Now, there has been a lot of debate on this, particularly in India. There's been a lot of criticism of attempts to rebuild. But let me put this in a very different perspective. Many of us travel to Europe. Do we realize how many of those cathedrals, those palaces were bombed during the Second World War? A lot of Europe's architectural heritage lay in ruins at the end of Second World War. It has all been reconstructed.
Hmm.
Imagine if they had thought, let's conserve it as found. Let us not rebuild anything because this belonged to the 18th century. If it's destroyed, it's destroyed. You cannot rebuild it in the 20th century. They did not do that. They rebuilt it. And we go and admire these things. But we are not allowed to let this happen in India. Why?
Hmm.
So I think we should look at these things a little bit more carefully. Let me look at lastly the what I said, buildings in use. Particularly in India also there is a lot of, so for instance there's an old temple, there's an old mosque which is in continuous use. Now obviously if they are being used in the 20th 21st century, they do need running water, they do need electricity, etc. They should get technical expertise on how to make sure that that building is upgraded and conserved in a proper manner, that you're not putting inappropriate materials like tile, like tiles which don't belong there, or
Yeah.
stone which was never intended to be there, but conserve it in the proper manner and at the same time upgrade. Put in your air conditioning, put in your electricity, put in all the things that you want, but do it in a sensitive manner. And for that, the use of uh, heritage experts is very, very important. We are doing a conservation project on St. James's Church,
Okay.
and showing that a building that is continuously in use can be upgraded, but in keeping with its heritage character, and its structural integrity should be maintained.
Right. Yes, I think it does make a lot of sense, especially with the example that you have given of Europe and how they sort of like rebuilt a lot of those monuments. And I read about a lot of them. I've personally visited a few of them, and it is actually very true. Not everything can be just left as they are found. Certain amount of modifications are like, or like restoration workers does very much become essential with certain monuments. And yes, I think that is absolutely very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Little, for taking out your precious time to talk to us. I'm so very sure that all of us here are going to appreciate whatever you have said to us and are going to listen very carefully to whatever you have discussed in the course of this interview. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.